Well, if you've got a Bible, you can open up to Mark chapter 8. We're about at the halfway point through Mark, if you can believe that already. Making a good clip here. We're going to look at the first 21 verses of chapter 8. So at about the halfway point through the Gospel of Mark, we have seen without a doubt, hopefully, that Jesus is indeed God with us, that He is indeed the Word who became flesh and dwelt among us, that He is indeed the God-man, and that He is indeed divine. Kind of as we've progressed through Mark, in just about every section that we've taken, we've seen Jesus in some way reveal his deity. And in the beginning, it was a little more kind of veiled claims of deity, but as we have progressed, the veil is coming off, and the claims of Jesus' deity are more and more overt. We've seen in 7 chapters now, as we get into chapter 8, we've seen that lame people have walked. We've seen that mute people have spoken. We've seen that deaf people have heard. We've seen that lepers have been cleansed. We've seen women who were sick and unclean and ostracized have been called daughter. We've seen a dead girl raised from the dead. We've seen demons cast out. We've seen the winds and the waves listen to Jesus. We've seen thousands of people fed with just a little bit of food. We're going to see that again today. And we've seen Jesus defy nature by walking on water. And if that's not enough to be convinced, I don't know what is. I don't know what is. And Jesus' disciples, they're not convinced yet. They've seen all these things firsthand. We read about these things and maybe are inspired by them, but Jesus' disciples saw these things firsthand, and we'll see again today that they're still not quite convinced of who Jesus is. And that tells us something of our human nature. Right? I can stand here and say these guys are knuckleheads if they haven't figured it out by now, but you know what? We're all knuckleheads that are trying to figure out things as we go. And even for those of us who have walked with the Lord for some time and have seen God move in our lives, we still have moments of doubt and moments of struggle and moments that we need to be reminded of His goodness. So maybe the disciples aren't such the knuckleheads that we think that they might be, or we're worse off than we think that we are, one of the two. But as we pick up in chapter 8, we're going to look at 3 different things today in our section. So we're going to look at the miracle in verses 1 to 10. We're going to look at the demand in 11 to 13, and we're going to look at the warning in 14 to 21. And so let's read starting in chapter 8, verse 1 of the Gospel of Mark. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, He, meaning Jesus, called His disciples to Him, and He said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and so, as some of them have come from far away. And His disciples answered Him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And He asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and He took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, He broke them and gave them to His disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, He said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and He sent them away. And immediately He got into the boat with His disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. So we'll pause there for a moment. So we see this second miracle similar to what we saw back in chapter 6. There are a few differences between the two. Some people contend that maybe there was only one feeding of a large crowd of people, but it seems pretty clear that there are 2 different feedings that have taken place. Worth noting, the first feeding of the 5,000 men that we read about, probably in all likelihood the feeding of 15,000 people, but it says that 5,000 men were fed. This one says that 4,000 people were fed, so maybe a little smaller crowd, but nonetheless impressive what Jesus has done. But it's worth noting that the first feeding that we read about in chapter 6 was a primarily Jewish crowd, and the feeding that we read about today in chapter 8 is primarily a Gentile crowd. And I think that matters. It matters because Jesus is revealing himself first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Right? The gospel is not restricted to just one subset of people, but open to all who would come and all who would believe. But we start out chapter 8 with this problem that a great crowd had gathered. And if you notice in Mark's gospel, crowds tend to gather around Jesus, right? Especially as we kind of progress, the crowds seem to get bigger and maybe more intense. And so a crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat. And we're told that they were in a desolate place. So they weren't near a town, they were out somewhere, probably in the desert, something like that. And so this crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat. And they were there, we're told, for 3 days. Now, I don't know exactly, when it says nothing to eat, I mean, what seems plain in the text is that maybe they didn't have anything to eat for 3 days. And I don't know about you, I would shrivel up and die if I didn't have anything to eat in 3 days. But somehow Jesus had gathered this crowd, and as they had gone some time without food and being in a desolate place, I don't know what the water situation was, but they were out there, and Jesus, we're told, has compassion. He says in verse 2, I have compassion on the crowd. And I think that matters, to know that Jesus has compassion on the crowd. Jesus is not annoyed by the crowd. Right? You can imagine if it were you or I and we had a crowd following us, we might become annoyed with the crowd. I could imagine, I don't want to read into the text things that aren't there, but I could imagine over 3 days that maybe there was some complaining happening. Somebody had to be complaining about how hungry they were. Somebody had to ask, when are we going to go back to wherever we came from? I mean, I don't know what this dynamic was, but you can imagine people were probably hangry by the time 3 days had passed around, and Jesus has compassion on them. You or I, we might just wish for the crowd to, like, everybody go home, right? Like, go home and have a Snickers, and you'll be better this afternoon. But Jesus had compassion upon the crowd. And he was worried about sending them away hungry for fear that they might not have the energy to make it home. So wherever they were was a distance, apparently, from anything. We don't know how far away they were, but it was long enough where Jesus had concern that they might not make it home in their famished state. And then the disciples, I find this remarkable, they ask a question: how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? It was only 2 chapters back that they witnessed the feeding of the 5,000. They've seen this movie before. Yet they ask, how's this going to work, Jesus? I would like to think, if it were me, I'd say, like, hey, do that thing again that you did the other day. But no, they question, which tells me that they still haven't quite figured out which way's up with respect to Jesus. And Jesus asks them, how many loaves do you have? We've talked about this before. When Jesus asks questions, it's not because he lacks the answer. This is Jesus having a teaching moment with his disciples, right? Kind of showing this same movie again. How many loaves how many loaves do we have this time, guys? Right? And they had 7. And he told the crowd to sit down, and he told the disciples to distribute the loaves. He gave thanks for the loaves, that matters, and tells his disciples to distribute the loaves, and asks them, how many fish do we have? And again, it's not that Jesus didn't know how many fish were there, but they had just had a few fish, the Bible tells us. Same thing, he gave thanks for the fish and told his disciples to distribute the fish. And the crowd ate, and they were satisfied. This is remarkable as well, and gives us an idea of the scope of the miracle that Jesus performed. This wasn't, hey, everybody, just take a little piece of the loaf as it comes by to tide you over. Right? I remember when I was a kid, when we would have family dinners, the cousins, like we weren't that patient, right, waiting for dinner. And we would always ask Grandma, she's making it, like, hey, can I have a bite of, the turkey or something? Like they'd give us something to tide us over until we sat down for dinner. This was not that. It says they ate until they were satisfied. And after 3 days, like you could imagine how hungry they might be. They ate and they were satisfied. So they ate a lot. They ate their fill. And not only did they eat their fill, but there were 7 baskets full of leftovers. So they weren't able to consume all that was put in front of them. And the Bible says there are about 4,000 people. And I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where there's a crowd of 4,000 people. That's a big crowd, right? It's a big crowd. We're just shy of that here this morning, so I know it might be hard to imagine 4,000 people, but they were fed to their satisfaction, and 7 baskets of leftovers were there. And then Jesus sent them away. And I don't think this was go on, get, now that you've eaten. I don't think it was that. Jesus just sent them on their way so they could go back about their business. I don't know what was going on. The Bible doesn't tell us what was going on during these 3 days. I might imagine that Jesus taught them for 3 days. I might imagine that Jesus walked among the crowd and among the people, and maybe part of why Jesus had compassion for the people is because he got to know them. Right? I think Jesus would have compassion on the crowd no matter what, because that's who Jesus is, but spending 3 days together, he probably got to know the people, and the people got to know him, and they probably got to listen to what he had to say. And I think Jesus' compassion went beyond their hunger. It went beyond their hunger, but he did satisfy their hunger. And there might be an analogy to be had here. Again, I don't want to read things into the text that aren't there, but there might be an analogy to be had here that Jesus is our satisfaction. There might be an analogy to be had here that Jesus said elsewhere that he's the bread of life. And as much as we need food for our sustenance, and really, like, you can go quite a while without food before you shrivel up. You're not going to shrivel up and die in 3 days, right? I was a little facetious about that, but you can actually go quite a long time without food. Water, not so much, but you can go quite a long time without food. But as much as we need food, we need the bread of life even more. And Jesus gave them their fill to their satisfaction with leftovers. And as we consider that he is the bread of life, that he would give us a sustenance that we can't see, that we can't physically touch, and that we need that more than we need actual bread. And again, this is primarily a Gentile crowd, and so Jesus is doing for the Gentiles what he did for the Jews just a couple of chapters back. And there's something to be said about that Jesus is making himself available both to the Jew and to the Gentile. And so this thing goes down, he sends the crowd away, and we're told that immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, I don't know if you've picked up on this in Mark, but Jesus is crossing the Sea of Galilee a lot, it would seem. Like he does this thing and then he goes to the other side, and then he does a thing there and he goes back to the other side and he does a thing and then he goes back to, it's just this back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. And you've noticed, hopefully in Mark's gospel, he uses this word immediately a lot. Right? It's part of how fast-paced Mark is. Jesus did this thing, and then he goes over here, and then he goes there, and then he's here, and then he's there. And so Mark is showing us the immediacy with which Jesus approaches his ministry. And so he crosses the Sea of Galilee. And as we pick up in verse 11, those pesky Pharisees show their heads again. The Pharisees came and they began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and he got into the boat again, and he went to the other side. I don't know how long it takes in the boat to go to the other side, but I would imagine it's not quick, right? No motorboats back then, so they're not, going at breakneck speed. So Jesus crosses after feeding the 4,000, and the Pharisees just happened to be there, as if maybe they were waiting for him, right? As if they knew the boat was coming, and they were waiting for him, and they began to argue with him, as the Pharisees did. And they were seeking from him a sign from heaven, not so they could figure out his deity, but it says they were seeking a sign so that they might test him. And that tells me that the Pharisees perhaps were not necessarily interested in the truth. They were trying to catch Jesus in a trap, which is what we see them often do. Right? They ask him questions to try to trip him up, kind of ask him impossible questions. And here they're trying to seek a sign from him in order to test him. And Jesus sighed deeply, and this isn't the first time that we've seen Jesus sigh either. You and I would sigh out of frustration. Why won't these people just go away? Jesus, maybe in his humanity, is sighing out of frustration, but in his deity, I know that his heart is broken that these people have not figured out who he's revealed himself to be. And Jesus asks another question. Why does this generation seek a sign? And again, it's not because he lacks the answer. This is Jesus demonstrating some patience with the Pharisees who, for me, my patience would have been pretty thin probably by now. Maybe gone altogether. But Jesus asks the question, why does this generation seek a sign? And then he makes this definitive statement, truly, like this makes it definitive, truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And what's remarkable about this is that he just fed 4,000 people. And on the heels of this, there's like, show us a sign. It's like, did you see what just happened? Right? Did you see just what happened? We see this in John's gospel as well, where Jesus fed a bunch of people with a little bit of food, and they demand a sign so that they may believe. And Jesus in John 6 tells them, it's the work of God that you believe. Like the sign that you're looking for is that you have belief. That's the sign that God has given you belief. And I don't know what kind of sign the Pharisees were looking for. They might not even have known what kind of sign they're looking for because they're just trying to trap Jesus. So they may not have had anything specific in mind, but we've all been maybe in a similar position, maybe not where we're trying to trap Jesus, but we've all been to a point in our life where we might say to God something along the lines that, God, if you do this thing for me, then I'll believe. Or if you do this thing for me or get me out of this bind, if you deliver in a certain way, then you'll have my allegiance. And so what does Jesus mean when he says no sign will be given to this generation? I think he's saying no sign in the way that you're asking will be given to this generation. Right? You're not going to have a physical sign just fall from heaven and drop in front of your feet, blinking to get your attention. That's not the way that God works. We've talked about this before, but Romans 1 tells us that everything we need to know about God can be seen by stepping outside and looking around. Look at the nature that he's created, the world that he's created. That should be enough. That should settle the argument. Yet it doesn't settle our argument because like the Pharisees and like the disciples, we're a fickle people. And we want to approach God on our own terms, not on his terms. We even develop in our minds a concept of who God is based on our own terms. And if you think about that, I get it because I do it too, but if you think about it, it's a bit silly that we as finite human beings, we have a beginning, we have an end, We're not all knowing. We're not all seeing. We're not all powerful. We're not all present. And as minute, finite human beings, we create this concept in our mind that God is a lot like me. God thinks a lot like I do. Right? God would never do the things that I would never do. God should do the things that I would do. And that's kind of silly. Because if God is just a little bit better of a version of you or a little bit better of a version of me, He's not worthy of our allegiance, and He's not worthy of our worship. If He's small enough, one pastor once said, for us to figure out, He's not big enough or grand enough for us to worship. And the Pharisees, I don't know that they're even trying to figure this out. The disciples, maybe they're trying to figure this out, but not quite there yet. And so Jesus has this encounter with the Pharisees, gives them this definitive statement. You're not going to get the sign that you're looking for. And then he gets back in the boat and immediately, again, goes to the other side. Verse 14. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not understand? And so another remarkable moment. They get in the boat and they forget to bring food. And to them, they still see this as a problem. Right? They still see this as a problem, even though they've seen Jesus twice now multiply the food in a massive way. And again, it's like, hey, Jesus, can you do this thing again? Right? We need some bread. And Jesus capitalizes on Jesus is not concerned about the bread. He's not concerned about the bread. And he uses this as a teaching moment, and he cautioned them, telling them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, leaven in the Bible, or yeast in the Bible, is never good. It's never a good thing. It's always kind of likened to this bad thing that gives rise to things that aren't good. And so Jesus is giving them a warning, and he mentions 2 specific kinds of leaven. The leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod as maybe being different yet related things. And so what is the leaven of the Pharisees and what is the leaven of Herod? And I think I talked about this a few weeks back, that there is a kind of skepticism, maybe a couple of kinds of skepticism. There's a kind of skepticism that only questions and is not interested necessarily in the answers, or that's not interested in finding the truth. There's a kind of skepticism that just questions everything. That's the leaven of the Pharisees. They're not interested in fact-finding. They're not interested in truth. They just want to win and be right in their skepticism. I think that's the leaven of the Pharisees. A questioning that is just perpetual. A questioning that comes from disbelief and that's disinterested in knowing what's true, that's disinterested in being challenged with the truth. The leaven of Herod, I think, is a little bit different. It's still a skepticism, but I think it's a little bit different. Herod seemed to know, at least to some extent, who Jesus was. He still came to a wrong conclusion about who Jesus was, but I don't think Herod's skepticism was a perpetual questioning. Herod just came to a wrong conclusion about the truth. And maybe he wasn't all that interested in the truth. Maybe he was only mildly interested in the truth. I don't know. But Herod did have a skepticism that arrived at the wrong conclusion. And I've said before, God can handle our skepticism. He can handle our questions, and He can handle our doubts. But in our skepticism, which we all have it to some degree or another, are you interested in knowing what's real and what's true? Are you interested in your assumptions being challenged? Are you open to the possibility that God may be entirely different than a little bit better version of you? Are you interested in knowing that an infinite, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-hearing, ever-present God might do things different than you would do them? And so the leaven of the Pharisees, I would call it just a straight-up disbelief. And I would distinguish disbelief from unbelief as not being the same thing. The leaven of Herod, I think, is an unbelief. And the distinguishing factor that disbelief, I would define as an active refusal to believe. Unbelief is maybe a little more passive. It's maybe a lack of belief. Maybe in its passivity, not actually seeking fully the truth, but disbelief would be just an active refusal to not believe, right? An active refusal to believe. And I think this is what Jesus is warning us about with the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Don't be passive in your believing or unbelieving. Don't be active in your refusal to believe. But be active in seeking the truth and engaging with the truth, even if it challenges your own assumptions, I think is what Jesus would say to us. He's warning us about a disbelief that gives rise to destructive skepticism, and he's warning us about an unbelief, a passive unbelief that's not all that concerned with the truth. And they began discussing, in verse 16 it tells us, the disciples, they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. They still don't get it. Jesus is trying to give them an object lesson, and they're hungry. And I kind of get this, right? When you're hungry, like there's nothing else on your mind, right? You don't care about much else until you get something to eat. I've been there. But they just don't get the object lesson that Jesus is laying down for them. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, and he asks them a series of questions. And again, it's not because Jesus lacks the answer to any of these questions, but he asks them several questions. Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Fair question. Hey guys, I'm trying to tell you something here, right? Let's keep on track. Let's focus. Why are you discussing that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Jesus is telling them, you don't get it. Are your hearts hardened? And what Jesus is really telling them is that your hearts are hardened. Right? We saw this a couple of chapters back, that when Jesus, remember one of the boat miracles, there's a couple of times we see Jesus in a boat defy nature. And we're told in one of those instances that the disciples' hearts were hardened, right? They see Jesus walking on the water and their hearts were hardened. Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Jesus is saying that these things should be plain to you. All you have to do is pay attention. Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets and broken pieces did you take up? And they acknowledged 12. Do you not remember the 7 loaves for the 4,000? How many baskets full did you take up? And they said to him, 7. Guys, do you remember what just happened? And do you remember what happened just a little bit before that? Yeah, we remember. We remember, Jesus. And finally, this series of questions. Do you not yet understand? And this would be a moment, again, if it were me, I would probably be shaking my head in frustration and just saying, you guys just don't get it. But Jesus, demonstrating some patience and graciousness towards his disciples, rather than giving them this definitive, harsh statement, he's asking them these leading questions. Do you not yet understand? And we see that they don't answer most of these questions. They don't answer most of these questions, but it would be the hope that these are questions that cause them to think. And again, we know how the story goes. We know that the disciples, they eventually figured this out. Right? Their hearts eventually became soft and inclined fully towards Jesus, because every single one of them would go on to die for their faith. They would go on to die in service of spreading the gospel through the known world. So they eventually got it. But just like we're seeing this progression of Jesus becoming more and more overt and showing us who he is, we see the progression of the disciples as they kind of wrestle to figure out who this man is that's right in front of him, right in front of them. And I think we can take some encouragement from this, that Jesus is patient with us in our doubts and in our wrestles. He's patient with us in our questioning of him. Even though you're here today, so obviously you've figured some things out to some degree, right? We still struggle. We still have difficult moments in our life where, we question God, or we even get mad at God. Sometimes we even shake our fist at God. One pastor once said that God's past faithfulness should demand our present trust. And that's true. God's past faithfulness absolutely should demand our present trust. However, we don't always presently trust, do we? We forget. Like the disciples, we forget like what just happened. We forget. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed with our circumstances that eyes are inward in this way instead of outward. I think it was Augustine who coined the phrase back in his day, a Latin phrase, incurvatus in se, which means that humanity is turned in or curved in on itself. And that's the problem of humanity. Somebody after Augustine, I can't remember who, coined the phrase versus ad diem, which is the opposite of incurvatus in se, and it means outward and upward. And that's our wrestle, is that the curve oftentimes maybe is inward when it should be outward and upward. And sometimes it is outward and upward, but not always. And so we're not all that different, I don't think, than the disciples. And I think Jesus might ask us at times some of these same questions. He might gently remind us we're focusing on the wrong thing. In this case, they were focusing on the bread. And Jesus is telling them, in a sense, stop worrying about yourself. Have I not shown you that I can feed you? Have I not shown you that I can feed you to your satisfaction even? You'll be full. Jesus sometimes might ask us, do you not perceive or do you not understand? Have you not paid attention to my past faithfulness and applied that past faithfulness to your present circumstance? Jesus might say to us, be careful that your heart is not getting hardened. Be careful that you don't have this active unbelief. And be careful even that your unbelief is not passively all that disinterested in the truth. Jesus might say to us, open your eyes and open your ears so you can see what's real and see what's true, and that you can hear what's real and hear what's true. He might say to us, remember what I've done for you in your life. Remember that I saved you. Remember that I've called you my own. Remember what you've seen me do in the lives of others and know that I can do that for you. Now, we do have to be careful. Sometimes we treat God as if he's our genie in a bottle. Right? If we rub the lamp just the right way, or if we ask him just the right way, then he'll grant every request that we have. And we know if any of you have ever prayed for anything, you know that God doesn't always give us what we ask for. He doesn't always give us what we want. For those that belong to him, he always gives us what we need. And that's not always the same as what we want or what we think we need, right? But he's saying, remember what I've done for you in the past, and know that I can do that for you now and in the future. And he's asking us, do you not yet understand? He's inviting us to understand. Right? This isn't an angry, you just don't get it. You'll never get it. It's not that. He's inviting us to understand who he is. Now, Jesus, I don't think, came to this earth to dwell among us primarily to do miracles, though he did miracles. I don't even think that Jesus' miracles are the primary thing that shows us that he's God, though they do show us that he is God, because he does things like this that just defy nature and logic. I think Jesus' miracles are meant to be more of an exclamation point upon him in the flesh, and that he's here, that God came and he dwelt among us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that he's given us this creation that sustains us and given us creation for our enjoyment. And he puts an exclamation mark on all of those things by doing things like feeding a whole lot of people with just a little bit of food. And so I think the big question for us in this, or the big takeaway in this text for us, is, are we wrestling with disbelief or unbelief, or do we have belief? Right? A passive lack of belief is just as dangerous as an active refusal to believe. And Jesus warns us about both. And he's inviting us to believe in him, to believe upon him. He's inviting us to believe that he is who he claims to be, that he is divine, that he is the divine Son of God, that he is God in the flesh. He's inviting us to believe, at this point in our text, the journey that he's on is for our good. And he's inviting us to believe that ultimately when he goes to the cross, that he really did take your sin and my sin, and that he suffered the just punishment that you and I rightly should have suffered, and that he died an unjust death as the sinless one on your behalf and my behalf. This is the gospel. And he's inviting us to believe that he conquered death by walking out of the grave. If Jesus was just a good man that died a tragic death, that'd be a horrible story. But Jesus wasn't just a good man that died a tragic death. He was the God-man that died for you and me. And in his dying for you and me and conquering of sin, he has transferred to us or imputed to us his righteousness. That's the most beautiful story ever told. And there's no tragedy to that story. The tragedy, maybe if there was one to the story, is that people don't believe. People don't believe that. And Jesus is inviting us to believe, to walk in an active belief that he is who he says he is, that he did what the Bible says that he did, and that it accomplished what the Bible tells us it accomplished. Because the Bible tells us that it's the gospel that has the power to save. Jesus, through his gospel, has the power to save. This is the thing that causes us to belong to him, is our belief in the gospel. And I'm not saying that we can never have questions. Please don't hear that. I'm not saying that if you ever question or wrestle with doubt that you're not saved. I'm not saying that at all. Have you ever read the Psalms? One page in the Psalms, David is praising God for how great he is. The next page, he's asking God why he's abandoning him and his enemies are going to kill him. Like David wrestled, like we can do that, and God can handle it. But there's a clear warning here against both an active refusal to believe and a passive lack of belief. And Jesus is calling us to an active faith that seeks the truth. And we're told that if we seek him with all of our heart, that we will indeed find him. And so be encouraged this morning, brothers and sisters, to seek God with all of your heart, even with your questions. Bring him your questions. Bring him your doubts. Shake your fist when you need to. And trust that he's going to meet you in that, and that he's going to be patient with you, like he was patient with his disciples until they figured it out. Father, thank you for this morning, and thank you that you do love us and that you are patient with us, that your suffering is long with us. Thank you that you put up with us knuckleheads and that you contend with us. Thank you that you have compassion for us, even when we doubt you. And so I would pray for us this morning that we would be able to come to you with our doubts and with our questions, that we would be active seekers of the truth, that you would squash our disbelief, that you would squash our unbelief, that you would give us a faith that actively seeks you, that you would help us to be interested in the truth, that you would help us to be willing to set our own assumptions aside and be corrected as we need to be corrected, and that you would help us as we seek you with all of our hearts, that we would find you. Lord, thank you, and we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.